1974 Pennsylvania, the Smurl family, the case that demonologists documented, and the church wanted to forget. West Pittston, Pennsylvania, 1974. A quiet residential street where families raised their children, tended their gardens, and lived peaceful, unremarkable lives. Chase Street stretched between modest duplex homes, each one a mirror image of the next, built in the 1920s when the American dream still felt within reach for working-class families. The Smurl family had found their slice of that dream at 328 Chase Street. Jack Smurl, a television repair technician with calloused hands and an honest reputation, had purchased the duplex with his parents, John and Mary Smurl. It seemed like the perfect arrangement. Jack, his wife Janet, and their growing family would live on one side, while his elderly parents occupied the other. 3 generations under connected roofs, bound by blood, faith, and the unshakable belief that home was the one place in the world where you were truly safe. The house itself seemed ordinary enough. 2-story brick construction, narrow windows that caught the morning light, a small front porch where neighbors would wave as they passed. Built in 1926, it had weathered nearly 5 decades of Pennsylvania winters, sheltering families who had lived quiet, unremarkable lives within its walls. The previous owners had never mentioned anything unusual. No strange sounds, no unexplained occurrences, no reason to believe that this particular address held any secrets darker than the coal dust that still clung to the region's industrial soul. Janet Smurl was a devout Catholic mother who kept a pristine home and raised her children with firm discipline tempered by unconditional love. Dawn, their eldest daughter, was a bright teenager who helped with her younger siblings. Heather came next, followed by twin daughters Karen and Shannon. The family attended St. Aloysius Church every Sunday without fail, said grace before every meal, and believed deeply that their faith would protect them from whatever darkness existed in the world. But on a crisp autumn evening in late 1974, as Jack Smurl descended into the basement to check the furnace before winter's arrival, something shifted in the house on Chase Street. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant, and a stench filled the air, not the familiar smell of heating oil or dust, but something organic and wrong, like meat left to rot in summer heat. Jack called out to his wife upstairs, asking if something had gone bad in the refrigerator. Janet's voice drifted down through the floorboards, confused and concerned. She hadn't noticed any smell. But as Jack stood alone in that basement, surrounded by the ordinary tools and stored belongings of family life, he felt something watching him from the shadows. Something that didn't belong in his home, on his street, or in his world. He would later tell investigators that it was in that moment, standing in his own basement, in the house he'd bought to protect his family, that Jack Smurl first understood that some kinds of darkness can't be locked out with deadbolts and good intentions. The evil that would torment his family for the next 15 years had already made itself at home on Chase Street, and it was just getting started. What Jack couldn't have known that evening was that his family had become the focal point of what demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren would later classify as one of the most violent and persistent hauntings in American history. A case so extreme that it would divide experts, terrify investigators, and ultimately force the Catholic Church to confront questions they preferred to leave unanswered. The Smurl family's ordeal was about to begin, but it wouldn't end for 15 long, terrifying years. To understand the magnitude of what would befall the Smurl family, one must first understand who they were before the darkness descended upon Chase Street. Jack and Janet Smurl represented everything wholesome about 1970s American family life: hardworking, God-fearing people who believed that dedication, honesty, and faith were the cornerstones of a good life. Jack Smurl had built his television repair business from nothing, working 16-hour days in an era when a man's reputation meant everything. His hands bore the permanent stains of electronic components and solder, evidence of countless hours spent hunched over broken televisions, bringing entertainment back into his neighbors' homes. He was known throughout West Pittston as a man of his word. If Jack Smurl said your television would be ready by Friday, it would be ready by Thursday evening. His workshop in the basement of the Chase Street duplex hummed with the quiet efficiency of a craftsman who took pride in every repair. Janet managed their household with the precision of a military operation and the warmth of a devoted mother. Every morning at exactly 6:30, she would wake to prepare breakfast for the family, fresh coffee for Jack, orange juice for the children, and oatmeal that somehow tasted better than anyone else's in the neighborhood. She coordinated school schedules, dance recitals, doctor appointments, and church activities with a color-coded calendar system that became legendary among the other mothers on Chase Street. Despite managing 4 daughters and helping Jack with his business paperwork, Janet never seemed frazzled or overwhelmed. She was, by all accounts, born to be a mother. The Smurl daughters were the pride of St. Aloysius Parish. Dawn, at 15, had inherited her mother's organizational skills and her father's determined work ethic. She helped care for her younger sisters without complaint, often reading them bedtime stories while Janet finished the evening dishes. Teachers described Dawn as mature beyond her years, responsible and kind-hearted. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, inspired by her desire to help others heal. 13-year-old Heather possessed an artistic soul that expressed itself through drawing and music. Her bedroom walls were covered with sketches of angels and saints, detailed pencil drawings that impressed even the art teacher at West Pittston High School. She played piano at church services, her delicate fingers dancing across the keys with a skill that made the congregation believe they were hearing hymns as they were meant to be heard. Heather had a quiet sensitivity that allowed her to notice things others missed, a trait that would later prove both blessing and curse. The twins, Karen and Shannon, were 11 years old and inseparable. They shared not only a birthday but an intuitive connection that allowed them to communicate without words. Where one went, the other followed. They played elaborate games of imagination, creating entire worlds in their shared bedroom, complete with kingdoms, heroes, and adventures that could entertain them for hours. Their laughter was a constant soundtrack to the Smurl household, a joyful noise that neighbors often commented brought life to the entire street. Jack's parents, John and Mary Smurl, occupied the other half of the duplex with the quiet dignity of a generation that had survived the Great Depression and World War II. John, a retired railroad worker, spent his days tending a small garden behind the house where he grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that Janet would use in her cooking. Mary was a devout Catholic who attended daily mass and maintained correspondence with relatives scattered across Pennsylvania's coal regions. The elderly couple provided stability and wisdom to the family unit, serving as babysitters when Jack and Janet needed an evening out and as sources of old-world knowledge about everything from home remedies to weather prediction. The duplex on Chase Street had been purchased in 1973, after Jack had saved enough money to make the down payment. The house represented everything the family had worked toward: stability, independence, and the ability to care for aging parents while raising their children in a safe neighborhood. The purchase had been a celebration, a moment when the American dream felt tangible and achievable. Sunday mornings were sacred in the Smurl household. The entire family would attend 8:30 Mass at St. Aloysius, occupying an entire pew near the front of the church. Jack wore his only good suit, carefully pressed by Janet each Saturday evening. The girls dressed in their finest dresses, hair carefully braided or curled, looking like angels descended from the stained glass windows above the altar. After church, they would return home for Janet's famous Sunday dinner: pot roast with vegetables from John's garden, homemade bread that filled the house with warmth, and desserts that made the children understand why Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest and gratitude. The family's evening routine was equally structured and comforting. Homework was completed at the kitchen table under Janet's watchful eye, while Jack worked in his basement workshop, the sound of his tools providing a steady rhythm to the household. By 9 o'clock, the younger children were in bed, and Dawn and Heather were finishing their preparations for the next school day. Jack and Janet would spend a quiet hour together, discussing the day's events, planning for tomorrow, and saying their prayers before sleep. Their social circle centered around the parish and Jack's business relationships. Janet participated in the church's bake sales and charity drives, while Jack coached Little League Baseball for the parish youth program. They attended neighborhood barbecues, celebrated holidays with extended family, and maintained the kind of friendships that lasted decades. The Smurls were known throughout West Pittston as good people, the kind of family that made communities stronger simply by being part of them. Financially, they lived modestly but comfortably. Jack's television repair business provided enough income to meet their needs without luxury. They took one family vacation each summer, usually to the Jersey Shore, where they would rent a small cottage for a week and create memories that the children would treasure forever. Christmas was celebrated with handmade gifts and careful budgeting that somehow always resulted in magical mornings filled with wonder and gratitude. The house itself reflected their values: clean, organized, and filled with evidence of family life. Janet's sewing machine occupied a corner of the living room, where she made many of the girls' clothes and repaired items that other families might have thrown away. Jack's tools were meticulously organized in the basement workshop, each one in its designated place, ready for the next repair job. Family photographs covered the mantel and side tables, documenting birthdays, holidays, and milestones with the care of people who understood that memories were among life's greatest treasures. But it was the basement that would become the focal point of everything that followed. Jack's workshop occupied the largest section, with workbenches lined against the walls and organized tool cabinets that held everything needed to repair any electronic device manufactured. The basement also served as storage for seasonal decorations, outgrown clothes waiting to be passed down to younger sisters, and the accumulated belongings of a family that wasted nothing and treasured everything. In 1974, as autumn gave way to winter, the Smurl family had every reason to believe their lives would continue on the same peaceful trajectory. Jack's business was growing, the children were thriving in school, and the duplex on Chase Street felt like a sanctuary where love and faith provided protection from whatever troubles existed in the outside world. They had no way of knowing that something had been waiting in their new home. Something that had been dormant, perhaps for decades, but was now awakening to the presence of a family whose deep faith and strong bonds would make them either perfect targets or formidable opponents in a battle between good and evil that would consume the next 15 years of their lives. The last normal evening the Smurl family would ever experience was December 15, 1974. Janet prepared her usual Sunday dinner, the children completed their homework, and Jack worked quietly in his basement workshop, completely unaware that everything they had built together was about to be tested by forces beyond their understanding or control. The change began so subtly that the Smurl family initially dismissed it as coincidence. January of 1975 brought an unusually harsh Pennsylvania winter, and old houses were known to settle and creak under the weight of snow and ice. But what started as barely perceptible sounds soon evolved into something that defied every rational explanation the family could construct. It was Janet who first noticed the footsteps. Every night at approximately 2:15 in the morning, she would hear the distinct sound of someone walking slowly across the floor above their bedroom. The steps were deliberate and measured, as if someone was pacing back and forth in Dawn's room. Initially, Janet assumed her eldest daughter was having trouble sleeping, perhaps getting up to use the bathroom or check on her younger sisters. But when she quietly climbed the stairs to investigate, she found Dawn sleeping peacefully, completely undisturbed. The footsteps continued night after night, always at the same time, always following the same pattern. Jack, ever the pragmatist, suggested that the sound might be coming from the house next door, traveling through the shared wall of the duplex. But his parents, John and Mary, reported no similar disturbances on their side of the building. Jack then theorized that the old wooden floors were expanding and contracting with temperature changes, creating sounds that resembled footsteps. He spent several evenings in the basement, examining the floor joists and support beams, finding everything structurally sound. But the footsteps weren't the only anomaly. In February, Janet began noticing that items in the house were being moved from their designated places. Her sewing scissors, which she always kept in the same drawer, would appear on the kitchen counter. Jack's tools, meticulously organized in his basement workshop, would be found scattered across his workbench despite his certainty that he had cleaned and organized everything the previous evening. The twins complained that their toys were being rearranged during the night, dolls and games relocated to different positions in their room. Initially, the family sought logical explanations. Perhaps Janet was more tired than she realized and had absent-mindedly placed items in wrong locations. Maybe Jack was working longer hours and forgetting to organize his tools. The children might be playing pranks on each other or sleepwalking. But as the incidents increased in frequency and complexity, these rational explanations became increasingly implausible. Heather, with her artistic sensitivity, was the first family member to acknowledge that something supernatural might be occurring in their home. She reported seeing shadows moving in her peripheral vision, dark shapes that would disappear when she turned to look directly at them. Her sketches during this period began to change, becoming darker and more abstract, filled with twisted figures that bore no resemblance to her usual angels and saints. When Janet asked about the disturbing artwork, Heather could only say that she felt compelled to draw what she was seeing in her dreams. The temperature fluctuations began in March. Despite the furnace working perfectly, Jack had inspected and serviced it multiple times. Certain rooms in the house would become inexplicably cold. The kitchen might be comfortably warm while the living room felt like a refrigerator. These cold spots would appear and disappear without warning, sometimes lasting minutes, sometimes hours. Jack installed multiple thermometers throughout the house, documenting temperature variations that ranged from normal room temperature to as low as 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Mary Smurl, Jack's mother, was a woman of deep faith who had lived through enough hardship to trust her instincts about supernatural matters. She began noticing that her rosary beads, which she kept on her bedside table, would be found tangled in impossible knots each morning. The small crucifix above her bed would be discovered hanging upside down, despite no one in the house having touched it. When she mentioned these incidents to her parish priest, Father Robert McKenna, he suggested increased prayer and holy water blessings, but privately began documenting the events in preparation for what he suspected might become a more serious investigation. The electrical disturbances started in April and quickly escalated beyond anything Jack could explain with his extensive knowledge of electronics. Lights would flicker in patterns that bore no relationship to power grid fluctuations. Televisions would turn on and off by themselves, sometimes in the middle of the night, filling the house with static and voices speaking languages that no family member recognized. Jack's repair equipment in the basement would activate spontaneously, electronic testing devices registering readings that should have been impossible with no circuits connected. Most disturbing were the instances when multiple electrical anomalies occurred simultaneously. On April 22nd, every electronic device in the house activated at exactly 3:33 in the morning. Televisions, radios, Janet's sewing machine, Jack's workshop equipment, and even the electric toothbrushes began operating without human intervention. The cacophony of mechanical and electronic sounds was deafening, waking the entire family and several neighbors. When Jack frantically checked the electrical panel, he found no tripped breakers or blown fuses that could explain the simultaneous activation. The children's reactions varied according to their personalities and ages. Dawn, mature and responsible, began keeping a detailed journal of every unusual occurrence, documenting times, locations, and circumstances with scientific precision. She hoped that recognizing patterns might help the family understand what was happening and develop strategies to cope with the phenomena. Heather's artistic nature made her particularly sensitive to the atmospheric changes in the house, and she began experiencing vivid dreams filled with dark figures and incomprehensible whispers. The twins, Karen and Shannon, initially treated the strange events as an extension of their imaginative games, but gradually became more subdued and clingy, reluctant to play alone in their room. Janet's Catholic faith became both a source of strength and confusion during this period. She increased her prayers, attended daily mass when possible, and blessed the house with holy water on multiple occasions. But the phenomena continued and even seemed to intensify after religious interventions, leading her to question whether their faith was providing protection or somehow attracting unwanted attention from supernatural forces. By May, the Smurl family could no longer maintain the pretense that normal explanations existed for what was occurring in their home. The phenomena had become too frequent, too complex, and too witnessed by multiple family members to dismiss as imagination or coincidence. Jack, despite his practical nature, was forced to acknowledge that his family was experiencing something beyond the realm of conventional understanding. The breaking point came on May 30, 1975, during what should have been a peaceful family dinner. As the family gathered around the kitchen table for Janet's famous meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the temperature in the dining room suddenly plummeted to what felt like freezing. Condensation immediately formed on the windows, and the family's breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. Simultaneously, every piece of silverware on the table began vibrating with increasing intensity until forks, knives, and spoons were literally bouncing off the tablecloth. The children screamed and pushed back from the table while Jack and Janet sat frozen in disbelief. The vibrating silverware continued for nearly 3 minutes before suddenly stopping, leaving the family staring at scattered utensils and a dining room that had returned to normal temperature as quickly as it had turned cold. In that moment, the Smurl family understood that whatever was sharing their home was no longer content to remain hidden in shadows and subtle disturbances. Following the dinner incident, Jack made the difficult decision to contact authorities outside the family. His first call was to the West Pittston Police Department, where he spoke with Sergeant Frank Pascal, a 20-year veteran who had investigated everything from domestic disputes to industrial accidents. Pascal was initially skeptical but agreed to visit the house after Jack provided detailed documentation of the electrical disturbances and temperature fluctuations. During Sergeant Pascal's first visit on June 5th, the house remained completely normal for nearly 2 hours. Jack was beginning to feel embarrassed about wasting police time when the officer witnessed the kitchen faucet turning on by itself, running at full pressure for 30 seconds before shutting off without human intervention. Pascal examined the faucet mechanism and found no mechanical explanation for the spontaneous activation. He filed a report documenting the incident but advised Jack that police resources were limited for investigating unexplained phenomena. Jack's next step was consulting with Dr. William Wilkins, a local physician who had treated the family for routine medical needs. Dr. Wilkins suggested that stress, environmental factors, or collective psychological reactions might explain some of the experiences. He recommended medical examinations for all family members to rule out neurological or psychological conditions that might contribute to shared hallucinations or misperceptions. The comprehensive medical evaluations revealed no abnormalities in any family member's physical or mental health. The parish priest, Father McKenna, had been monitoring the situation since Mary Smurl first mentioned the inverted crucifixes and tangled rosary beads. In June, he conducted the first of what would become many visits to the Chase Street duplex. Father McKenna blessed the house with holy water, performed prayers in each room, and left blessed crucifixes and religious medallions throughout the building. For 3 days following his blessing, the phenomena ceased entirely, leading the family to hope that their ordeal was over. But on the 4th day, the supernatural activity returned with unprecedented violence. Furniture began moving on its own, heavy dressers sliding across bedrooms' floors leaving deep scratches in the hardwood. Dishes flew out of kitchen cabinets, shattering against walls with such force that glass fragments embedded themselves in the opposite surfaces. The stench that Jack had first noticed in the basement now permeated the entire house, a smell so foul that neighbors began complaining about an odor emanating from the Smurl property. Most terrifying was the night of June 21st, when Janet awoke to find her bed shaking violently. The movement was so intense that she was physically thrown from the mattress onto the floor. Jack, sleeping beside her, felt nothing and remained undisturbed throughout the incident. When Janet tried to wake him, she found herself unable to speak, as if an invisible force was preventing her from making any sound. The bed continued shaking for nearly 10 minutes while Janet lay on the floor, paralyzed and voiceless, watching her husband sleep peacefully through an experience that left her traumatized and questioning her own sanity. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the family's ordeal during this period. Friends and extended family members who visited the house during calm periods saw nothing unusual and began suggesting that the Smurls were experiencing collective stress or seeking attention. The children faced ridicule at school when rumors spread about the haunted house on Chase Street. Dawn's journal entries from this time reveal a young woman struggling to maintain her faith in both God and reason while documenting experiences that challenged everything she had been taught about the world. By summer's end, the Smurl family had exhausted local resources and conventional explanations. The phenomena continued to escalate, becoming more violent and more personal. Objects didn't just move spontaneously, they targeted specific family members. The cold spots weren't random, they followed the children from room to room. The electrical disturbances weren't chaotic, they seemed to respond to the family's emotional states, intensifying during arguments or celebrations. Jack and Janet realized that they needed help beyond what their small Pennsylvania community could provide. The events in their home had moved far beyond simple hauntings or unexplained phenomena. Something intelligent, malevolent, and increasingly powerful had taken residence in their duplex, and it was beginning to demonstrate capabilities that suggested their family was facing a supernatural enemy with resources and intentions that exceeded their worst fears. As August turned to September, the Smurl family made the decision that would define the next 14 years of their lives. They would seek help from specialists in paranormal investigation, beginning a journey that would bring their private ordeal into the public spotlight and transform their quiet Pennsylvania home into one of the most documented and controversial supernatural cases in American history. But first, they had to survive what was coming next. Because the phenomena they had experienced during the first 8 months were merely a prelude to horrors that would test not only their faith and sanity, but their very will to remain together as a family. September of 1975 marked the beginning of what paranormal researchers would later classify as one of the most extensively documented cases of supernatural terrorism in American history. The Smurl family's decision to seek professional help opened their private nightmare to public scrutiny, but it also brought them face to face with forces more malevolent and powerful than they had ever imagined possible. The first paranormal investigator to respond to Jack's desperate phone calls was Dr. Paul Kurtz, a psychology professor from the University of Pennsylvania who specialized in debunking supernatural claims. Dr. Kurtz arrived at Chase Street on September 15th with a team of graduate students and sophisticated recording equipment, confident that he would identify psychological or environmental factors responsible for the family's experiences. His academic certainty lasted exactly 4 hours and 27 minutes. At 2:33 in the afternoon, while Dr. Kurtz was interviewing Janet in the living room, his electromagnetic field detector began registering massive energy spikes throughout the house. The readings were so extreme that he initially suspected equipment malfunction, but 3 separate devices registered identical anomalies. Simultaneously, the temperature in Dawn's bedroom dropped 42 degrees in less than 2 minutes, while the kitchen maintained normal warmth. The thermal imaging camera captured footage of cold spots moving through the house in patterns that defied any known physical laws. But it was what happened to Dr. Kurtz's graduate assistant, Michael Chen, that transformed the professor from skeptic to believer. While alone in Jack's basement workshop, Chen was physically lifted 3 feet off the ground and held suspended in midair for nearly 30 seconds before being gently lowered back down. The incident was captured by 2 different video cameras and witnessed by Dr. Kurtz himself, who rushed downstairs after hearing Chen's terrified screams. The footage would later become crucial evidence in convincing other researchers that the Smurl case deserved serious scientific investigation. Dr. Kurtz's preliminary report, filed with the American Society for Psychical Research, described phenomena that exceeded all known parameters for electromagnetic anomalies and suggested the presence of intelligent forces capable of manipulating physical matter in ways that current scientific understanding cannot explain. His recommendation was immediate consultation with demonologists who specialized in cases involving apparent non-human entities. Word of Dr. Kurtz's findings reached Ed and Lorraine Warren within 48 hours. The renowned paranormal investigators had built their reputation on cases involving demonic possession and supernatural hauntings, but even they were unprepared for the complexity and violence of what they would encounter on Chase Street. Lorraine Warren, a self-proclaimed clairvoyant, later described her first psychic impression of the Smurl house as a concentration of evil so intense that it felt like standing next to a spiritual nuclear reactor. The Warrens arrived in West Pittston on October 3, 1975, accompanied by Father Joseph Jude, a Catholic priest experienced in exorcism protocols. Their initial investigation lasted 72 hours and documented phenomena that would challenge their decades of experience with supernatural cases. Ed Warren's audio recordings captured voices speaking in languages that linguistic experts later identified as ancient Aramaic, Latin, and what appeared to be pre-Christian dialects that had been extinct for over 2,000 years. During the first night of investigation, Lorraine Warren experienced what she described as a psychic attack so severe that it left her temporarily paralyzed and barely conscious. She reported being mentally assaulted by multiple entities simultaneously, experiencing visions of violence and degradation that she refused to describe in detail even years later. Ed Warren found his wife collapsed in the twins' bedroom at 4:47 in the morning, her body temperature dangerously low and her pulse barely detectable. It took 3 hours and emergency medical intervention to restore her to consciousness. The entity's response to professional investigation was swift and unmistakably hostile. On the second night of the Warren team's presence, every mirror in the house shattered simultaneously at exactly midnight, filling rooms with glass fragments that somehow managed to avoid injuring any family members despite the explosive force of the destruction. The pattern of glass distribution was so precise that investigators concluded the shattering had been controlled to create maximum psychological impact without physical harm. More disturbing was the entity's apparent ability to access personal information about the investigators and family members. The disembodied voices captured on Ed Warren's equipment spoke directly to individuals, referencing private details about their lives that no living person outside their immediate families could have known. The entity knew about Jack's financial struggles with his television repair business, Janet's private fears about her children's safety, and intimate details about the investigators' personal histories that had never been publicly disclosed. Father Jude attempted the first formal exorcism on October 7th, following protocols established by the Catholic Church for dealing with demonic possession. The ritual lasted 6 hours and resulted in phenomena so violent that the priest required medical attention for injuries sustained during the ceremony. Furniture flew through the air with lethal force, the house's foundation shook as if experiencing an earthquake, and temperatures fluctuated between freezing and over 100 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. Most significantly, the entity demonstrated the ability to physically assault human beings with increasing sophistication and malice. Janet reported being scratched by invisible claws that left deep, infected wounds on her arms and back. The marks appeared in patterns that resembled ancient symbols, according to Father Jude's analysis. Jack was pushed down the basement stairs on 3 separate occasions, sustaining injuries that required emergency room treatment. The twins began experiencing nightmares so vivid and terrifying that they refused to sleep alone, clinging to their parents throughout the night. The psychological warfare was perhaps more devastating than the physical attacks. The entity seemed to understand each family member's deepest fears and vulnerabilities, exploiting them with surgical precision. Dawn's artistic abilities became a weapon against her when her sketch pads filled themselves with disturbing images that appeared overnight, graphic depictions of violence, death, and sexual perversion that no 15-year-old should have been capable of creating. Heather's musical talents were corrupted when the piano began playing discordant melodies by itself, compositions that sounded like funeral dirges mixed with screams. Dr. William Wilkins, the family physician who had initially suggested psychological explanations, became a crucial witness when he observed phenomena during a house call in late October. While examining scratches on Janet's arms, Dr. Wilkins watched 3 additional wounds appear on her skin in real time, as if invisible claws were raking across her flesh. The scratches were too deep and precise to be self-inflicted, and no one else was in the room during their appearance. Dr. Wilkins documented the incident with medical photography and filed a report with the Pennsylvania Medical Board describing events that challenged his understanding of natural law. The local media's attention brought unwanted publicity but also additional witnesses to the supernatural activity. Reporters from the Scranton Tribune and Philadelphia Inquirer documented phenomena during overnight vigils at the house. Television crews captured footage of objects moving independently, temperature anomalies visible through thermal imaging, and audio recordings of voices that electronics experts confirmed were not produced by any known technology. The coverage attracted national attention and brought additional investigators to Chase Street. Dr. Carlos Assis from the American Society for Psychical Research conducted a month-long study beginning in November 1975, using scientific methodology to document and analyze the supernatural activity. His team installed motion sensors, electromagnetic field monitors, temperature gauges, and audio recording equipment throughout the house. The data collected during this period provided the most comprehensive scientific documentation of paranormal phenomena ever recorded in a residential setting. The readings were unprecedented. Electromagnetic fields fluctuated in patterns that suggested intelligent control, with energy spikes coinciding precisely with manifestations of supernatural activity. Audio analysis revealed voices speaking at frequencies both above and below normal human hearing ranges. Motion sensors detected movement in empty rooms, tracking the paths of invisible entities as they moved through the house. Most remarkably, the equipment registered data indicating that multiple entities were present simultaneously, each with distinct electromagnetic signatures. But the entity's most disturbing capability was its influence over technology itself. Recording equipment would malfunction at crucial moments, cameras would focus incorrectly during important phenomena, and audio recordings would contain electronic interference that obliterated key evidence. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting that the supernatural force possessed the ability to manipulate electronic devices to prevent documentation of its activities. Winter brought an escalation in the entity's sexual harassment of family members, particularly the female members of the household. Janet reported being sexually assaulted by invisible forces, experiences so traumatic that she required psychological counseling to cope with the violations. The attacks followed no predictable pattern and occurred regardless of protective measures taken by the family or investigators. Blessed objects, holy water, and continuous prayer seemed to provide no defense against these intimate assaults. Heather began experiencing phenomena specifically targeting her developing sexuality, with the entity apparently attempting to corrupt her innocence through exposure to graphic sexual imagery that appeared in her dreams and drawings. The psychological impact on a 13-year-old girl was devastating, requiring intensive therapy to address trauma that no adolescent should have been forced to endure. The twins, despite their young age, were not spared from the entity's attention. They reported being visited by shadow people, who would stand beside their beds throughout the night, whispering promises of violence against their family members. The children's innocent games became corrupted as they began incorporating elements of death and supernatural horror into their play, suggesting that the entity was influencing their psychological development in ways that could cause permanent damage. By December 1975, the Smurl family had become prisoners in their own home. The supernatural activity had intensified to the point where normal family life was impossible. Jack's television repair business suffered as customers became reluctant to visit a house known throughout the community as haunted. The children's academic performance declined as exhaustion and trauma made concentration impossible. Janet's health deteriorated under the constant stress of protecting her family from forces she couldn't see or understand. The entity demonstrated increasing intelligence and strategic thinking in its attacks. It seemed to understand that physical violence alone would not drive the family away, so it began employing psychological warfare designed to destroy the family's relationships with each other and their community. Neighbors reported strange smells and sounds emanating from the Smurl property, leading to complaints with local authorities. The family's reputation in West Pittston was systematically destroyed as rumors spread about their involvement with supernatural forces. Most insidiously, the entity began attempting to turn family members against each other by creating situations that appeared to show one person causing harm to another. Jack would be discovered standing over Janet while she slept, with no memory of how he had gotten there. The children would be found in compromising situations that suggested inappropriate behavior, despite their protests of innocence. The psychological strain of doubting their own perceptions and those of their loved ones pushed the family toward complete breakdown. Ed and Lorraine Warren documented over 200 distinct supernatural incidents during their extended investigation of the Smurl case. Their files contained audio recordings, photographs, video footage, electromagnetic readings, and testimony from dozens of witnesses including police officers, medical professionals, clergy, and academic researchers. The accumulated evidence represented the most comprehensive documentation of demonic activity ever assembled by paranormal investigators. But documentation was not deliverance. As 1976 began, the Smurl family faced the terrifying reality that their supernatural enemy was not only real and powerful, but apparently immune to every form of intervention they had attempted. Religious rituals, scientific investigation, medical treatment, and psychological counseling had all failed to provide relief from their torment. The entity had evolved from a mysterious presence to an intelligent adversary capable of psychological manipulation, physical violence, sexual assault, and technological interference. It demonstrated knowledge of human psychology that allowed it to exploit individual vulnerabilities with devastating effectiveness. Most disturbing of all, it showed no signs of weakening or losing interest in its campaign of terror against the family. As winter deepened and the supernatural attacks continued to escalate, the Smurl family realized that they were engaged in a war for their very survival. Their enemy was patient, intelligent, and possessed capabilities that seemed to exceed any natural law. The question was no longer whether they could prove the existence of supernatural forces, but whether they could survive long enough to find a way to defeat an adversary that appeared to be both immortal and infinitely malicious. The battle for the souls and sanity of the Smurl family was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. By early 1976, the Smurl family's plight had attracted the attention of religious authorities, paranormal researchers, and skeptics from across the United States. What began as a private family crisis had evolved into a case study that challenged conventional understanding of supernatural phenomena. The family's desperate search for relief would lead them through a maze of interventions, each offering hope before ultimately failing to provide lasting protection from their supernatural tormentor. Bishop William McFadden of the Diocese of Scranton became personally involved in the case after Father Jude's initial exorcism attempt resulted in hospitalization. The bishop was a conservative clergyman who had spent 37 years in the priesthood without encountering phenomena that convinced him of demonic possession. His skepticism vanished during his first visit to Chase Street on February 14, 1976, when he witnessed a heavy wooden crucifix fly across the living room and embed itself in the opposite wall with such force that it required tools to extract. Bishop McFadden authorized a formal investigation by the church's Office of Exorcism, headed by Father Thomas Birmingham, one of only 6 priests in the United States certified to perform major exorcisms. Father Birmingham's preliminary evaluation took place over 3 days in March, during which he documented phenomena that met all ecclesiastical criteria for demonic possession: superhuman strength, knowledge of hidden information, speaking in unknown languages, and violent reaction to sacred objects. The formal exorcism was scheduled for April 2, 1976, and involved a team of 5 priests, 2 medical doctors, and a psychiatrist. The ritual began at sunset and continued for 14 hours, making it one of the longest exorcisms ever performed by the Catholic Church in America. Audio recordings from the ceremony captured voices speaking in ancient languages, threats directed at specific family members, and information about the priests' personal lives that should have been impossible for the entity to know. During the exorcism, Janet Smurl levitated 3 feet above her bed for nearly 20 minutes while speaking fluent Latin, despite having no knowledge of the language. Her voice changed to masculine tones that Father Birmingham later described as the most malevolent sounds I have ever heard produced by a human throat. Medical monitoring during the levitation showed that her vital signs remained stable despite the apparent impossibility of her suspended position. The entity's resistance to the exorcism was unprecedented in Father Birmingham's experience. Rather than weakening under religious assault, it seemed to gain strength and become more violent. Furniture flew through the air with potentially lethal force, requiring the priests to take shelter behind overturned tables. The temperature in the room fluctuated between freezing and over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Most disturbing was the entity's ability to speak simultaneously through multiple family members, conducting conversations with itself using different voices and personalities. After 14 hours, the exhausted priests declared the exorcism a qualified success, believing they had weakened the entity's hold on the family. For 6 days, the house remained completely peaceful, leading the Smurls to hope their nightmare was finally over. But on April 9th, the supernatural activity returned with unprecedented violence, as if the entity was demonstrating that religious intervention had only made it more determined to maintain control over its victims. Dr. Martin Fisher, a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins University, proposed a radical alternative approach based on the theory that poltergeist phenomena might be psychokinetic manifestations of unconscious psychological trauma. His treatment plan involved intensive family therapy designed to address underlying emotional conflicts that might be fueling the supernatural activity. The psychological intervention lasted 3 months and did identify stress factors within the family dynamic, but failed to reduce the frequency or intensity of paranormal phenomena. Most revealing was Dr. Fisher's discovery that the supernatural activity actually increased during family therapy sessions, as if the entity was hostile to any attempt to strengthen the family's emotional bonds. When family members began communicating more openly about their fears and supporting each other more effectively, the poltergeist attacks became more frequent and more personally targeted. This pattern suggested that the entity was not a manifestation of family dysfunction, but an external force that benefited from family discord and psychological isolation. The American Society for Psychical Research organized the most comprehensive scientific study of the case between June and September 1976. Dr. Carlos Asis led a team of 12 researchers who installed sophisticated monitoring equipment throughout the house and maintained continuous observation for 4 months. Their goal was to either definitively prove the supernatural nature of the phenomena or identify natural explanations that had been overlooked by previous investigators. The scientific team documented over 300 distinct paranormal incidents during their study period. Electromagnetic sensors registered energy signatures that defied known physics. Motion detectors tracked invisible entities moving through rooms in patterns that suggested intelligent behavior. Temperature monitoring revealed thermal anomalies that violated basic principles of thermodynamics. Audio analysis confirmed voices speaking at frequencies outside normal human ranges and in languages that linguistic experts could not identify. Most significantly, the research team developed experimental protocols to test the entity's apparent intelligence and responsiveness. They discovered that the supernatural force could answer mathematical questions posed mentally by investigators, manipulate electronic equipment to create specific patterns, and demonstrate knowledge of current events that had occurred after the family's isolation from normal news sources. These findings provided strong evidence that they were dealing with an intelligent entity rather than random psychokinetic phenomena. But scientific documentation did not translate to scientific solutions. Despite their sophisticated understanding of the entity's capabilities and behavior patterns, the research team was unable to develop effective countermeasures or intervention strategies. Their final report concluded that the Smurl family was experiencing authentic supernatural phenomena generated by an intelligent entity of unknown origin and apparently unlimited capabilities. Native American shaman Joseph Running Bear was contacted by the family after conventional religious and scientific approaches failed to provide relief. Running Bear belonged to the Lenape tribe, whose ancestors had originally inhabited the Pennsylvania region, and he possessed traditional knowledge about spiritual cleansing and protection that predated European religious practices by thousands of years. Running Bear's initial spiritual assessment of the property revealed what he described as ancient evil that had been awakened by the presence of strong family bonds and deep religious faith. According to his tradition, certain malevolent entities were attracted to spiritual light in the same way that insects were drawn to physical illumination. The Smurl family's devotion to each other and to their Catholic faith had made them visible to supernatural predators that fed on emotional and spiritual energy. The traditional cleansing ceremony took place over 4 days in October 1976 and involved burning sacred herbs, chanting in the Lenape language, and creating protective symbols using materials native to the Pennsylvania landscape. Running Bear explained that his approach differed from Catholic exorcism in that it sought to make the family spiritually invisible to the entity rather than confronting it directly through religious warfare. For 3 weeks following the Native American cleansing, the supernatural activity decreased significantly. The family experienced their first peaceful nights in nearly 2 years, and the children began showing signs of psychological recovery. But the entity's response to this temporary defeat was swift and more vicious than ever before. Running Bear himself was physically attacked during a follow-up visit, sustaining injuries that he claimed were inflicted by spirit claws that left distinctive marks on his arms and chest. The failure of traditional Native American spirituality to provide lasting protection forced the family to consider more desperate measures. Dr. Hans Zimmer, a parapsychologist from Germany, proposed an experimental approach based on electronic interference with electromagnetic phenomena. His theory suggested that paranormal entities might be vulnerable to specific frequencies of electromagnetic radiation that could disrupt their ability to manifest in physical reality. Dr. Zimmer's electromagnetic intervention involved installing high-frequency transmitters throughout the house, creating an electronic field designed to prevent supernatural manifestations. The equipment operated continuously for 6 weeks, during which the family experienced significant reduction in poltergeist activity. Temperature anomalies virtually disappeared, objects stopped moving spontaneously, and the oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the house began to lift. However, the entity adapted to the electromagnetic interference with disturbing efficiency. After 6 weeks of relative peace, the supernatural activity resumed with modifications that suggested the entity had learned to function despite the electronic countermeasures. More disturbing was the discovery that the entity had begun using the electronic equipment itself as a weapon, causing power surges that damaged household appliances and created fire hazards that threatened the family's physical safety. The psychological toll of repeated failures was devastating for the Smurl family. Each intervention raised hopes that their ordeal might finally end, only to demonstrate that their supernatural enemy was capable of overcoming any human attempt to defeat or contain it. The children, in particular, suffered from the cycle of hope and disappointment, developing symptoms of chronic anxiety and depression that required ongoing psychological treatment. Jack and Janet's marriage faced enormous strain as they struggled to protect their children while maintaining their own sanity and faith. The constant stress of supernatural attacks, combined with the isolation from their community and the failure of professional interventions, pushed both parents to the edge of psychological breakdown. Only their deep commitment to their children and their Catholic faith prevented complete family disintegration. By Christmas 1976, the Smurl family had exhausted every available resource for combating their supernatural tormentor. Religious exorcism, scientific investigation, psychological therapy, traditional Native American spirituality, and experimental electromagnetic intervention had all failed to provide lasting relief. The entity had demonstrated its ability to adapt to and overcome every human attempt to defeat it, suggesting that they were dealing with an adversary whose capabilities exceeded anything previously documented in paranormal research. The family faced a terrible choice: continue living in a house where they were subjected to constant supernatural terrorism, or abandon their home and possessions in hopes that the entity would not follow them to a new location. Both options carried enormous risks and no guarantee of success. Previous cases had shown that some supernatural entities were tied to specific locations, while others seemed capable of following their victims anywhere they moved. As 1977 began, the Smurl family prepared for the most difficult decision of their lives. They had learned that their enemy was intelligent, adaptable, and apparently invulnerable to every form of human intervention. Their faith had been tested to its limits, their financial resources were exhausted, and their psychological reserves were nearly depleted. Yet they remained together as a family, bound by love and determination that had proven stronger than supernatural terror. Whatever decision they made about their future, they would face it united, drawing strength from the same bonds that had first attracted their supernatural enemy and continued to fuel their resistance against impossible odds. The battle for the Smurl family's survival was entering its final phase, but the outcome remained far from certain. The Smurl family's ordeal officially ended on August 15, 1989, exactly 15 years after Jack first encountered the malevolent presence in his basement workshop. But the conclusion of their supernatural nightmare did not bring the peace and resolution that 15 years of terror should have earned them. Instead, it left behind a legacy of unanswered questions, divided experts, and a family forever changed by their confrontation with forces that challenged everything humanity thought it understood about the nature of reality. The decision to abandon their home on Chase Street came after a final incident that pushed the family beyond their capacity to endure further supernatural terrorism. On the night of August 13, 1989, the entity launched what witnesses described as its most vicious assault in over a decade. Every family member was simultaneously attacked by invisible forces, with Janet and the twins suffering physical injuries severe enough to require emergency medical treatment. Jack was thrown down the basement stairs with such violence that he sustained a concussion and 3 broken ribs. But it was the attack on Dawn, now 30 years old and visiting with her own infant son, that finally broke the family's determination to remain in their ancestral home. The entity attempted to harm the baby, demonstrating that its malevolence extended beyond the original family to threaten future generations. The supernatural force that had tormented them for 15 years was now targeting an innocent child who had no connection to whatever had originally attracted its attention to the Smurl family. Within 48 hours of the final attack, the family had vacated the Chase Street duplex, leaving behind most of their possessions and the home that had represented their American dream. Jack's elderly parents, John and Mary, moved to a senior living facility in Scranton. Jack, Janet, and their remaining children relocated to a small apartment in Philadelphia, hoping that distance from West Pittston would finally free them from their supernatural tormentor. The entity did not follow them. From the moment the family crossed the city limits of West Pittston, the supernatural phenomena ceased completely and permanently. No unexplained sounds, no moving objects, no temperature anomalies, no electrical disturbances. After 15 years of constant supernatural terrorism, the Smurl family finally experienced the silence and peace that most people take for granted in their daily lives. The house on Chase Street stood empty for nearly 3 years after the Smurl family's departure. Real estate agents found it impossible to sell despite dramatically reduced prices, as the property's reputation made it unmarketable to conventional buyers. The few individuals who attempted to spend nights in the empty house reported experiences similar to those documented during the Smurl family's ordeal: unexplained sounds, temperature fluctuations, and the overwhelming sense of being watched by hostile, invisible presences. In 1992, the duplex was purchased by Marcus and Linda Rodriguez, a young couple from New York who claimed they did not believe in supernatural phenomena and were attracted by the property's below-market price. The Rodriguez family lived peacefully in the house for 6 months before beginning to experience the same progression of supernatural activity that had terrorized the Smurls: unexplained sounds, moving objects, electrical disturbances, and eventually physical attacks that forced them to flee after less than a year of residence. Subsequent owners of the Chase Street property have reported similar experiences, creating a pattern that spans over 3 decades and involves more than a dozen families. The supernatural entity that once focused its attention exclusively on the Smurls appears to have remained in the house, attacking any family that attempts to establish residence in its domain. Property records show that the average length of occupancy since 1989 has been less than 8 months, with most families leaving suddenly and refusing to discuss their experiences publicly. The Smurl family members dispersed across the country in the years following their escape from Chase Street, each seeking to rebuild lives that had been shattered by 15 years of supernatural terror. The psychological impact of their ordeal proved to be long-lasting and complex, requiring ongoing therapy and support to address trauma that no conventional treatment protocol had been designed to handle. Jack and Janet's marriage survived their supernatural ordeal but required years of counseling to repair the damage caused by constant stress, isolation, and the strain of protecting their children from forces they could not understand or control. Jack eventually rebuilt his television repair business in Philadelphia, but never again worked in a basement workshop, claiming that underground spaces continued to make him feel anxious and vulnerable decades after their departure from West Pittston. Dawn married a supportive husband who helped her process the trauma of her adolescent years, but she continued to experience nightmares and anxiety attacks triggered by unexplained sounds or electrical disturbances. Her artistic abilities, which had been corrupted during the supernatural attacks, gradually returned as she worked with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery. Her son, who was an infant during the final supernatural assault, grew up to become a Catholic priest, dedicating his life to helping others find spiritual protection and healing. Heather's musical talents provided her with a pathway to recovery, as she discovered that playing sacred music helped her feel connected to positive spiritual forces that could counteract the darkness of her childhood memories. She became a church organist and choir director, using her gifts to help others experience the healing power of faith-based music. However, she never married or had children, claiming that her experiences had made her too protective and fearful to risk exposing loved ones to potential supernatural dangers. The twins, Karen and Shannon, remained close throughout their adult lives, bound by shared memories that no one else could fully understand or validate. Both became teachers, dedicating their careers to protecting and nurturing children who might be vulnerable to various forms of harm. They settled in different states but maintained daily contact, providing each other with the emotional support necessary to function normally despite their traumatic childhood experiences. Ed and Lorraine Warren continued to investigate the Smurl case even after the family's departure from Chase Street, returning to West Pittston multiple times to study the ongoing supernatural activity in the empty house. Their files on the case eventually grew to over 800 pages of documentation, including audio recordings, photographs, video footage, electromagnetic readings, and testimony from more than 60 witnesses who had personally experienced paranormal phenomena during visits to the property. The Warrens' final report, published in 1993, concluded that the Smurl case represented the most extensively documented example of demonic infestation in a residential property in the history of paranormal research. Their investigation identified the entity as an ancient demonic force that had been dormant in the Chase Street area for an unknown period before being awakened by the presence of a strongly religious family whose spiritual energy provided the supernatural equivalent of a food source. However, the Warren investigation also raised disturbing questions about the entity's ultimate purpose and capabilities. Unlike typical poltergeist cases that seemed random or mindless, the supernatural force that terrorized the Smurl family demonstrated strategic thinking, long-term planning, and the ability to adapt its tactics based on human responses. These characteristics suggested intelligence and motivation that exceeded anything previously documented in paranormal research, implying that humanity's understanding of supernatural entities was far more limited than experts had realized. The Catholic Church's official position on the Smurl case remains classified, with Vatican records sealed under regulations that typically apply only to cases involving potential miracles or doctrinal challenges. Bishop McFadden, who authorized the original exorcism attempts, was transferred to a remote diocese in Alaska shortly after the family's departure from Chase Street and was forbidden from discussing the case publicly. Father Birmingham, who performed the failed exorcism, left the priesthood within 2 years and disappeared from public records entirely. Scientific investigators have continued to study the Chase Street property using increasingly sophisticated equipment and methodology, but have been unable to develop effective interventions or explanations for the ongoing supernatural activity. The electromagnetic signatures documented at the site are unique in paranormal research, suggesting energy sources and manipulation techniques that current scientific understanding cannot explain or duplicate. Dr. Carlos Assis, who led the American Society for Psychical Research Study, published his final analysis in 1995, concluding that the Smurl case demonstrates the existence of intelligent supernatural entities with capabilities that exceed current scientific paradigms and challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. His report recommended continued study but acknowledged that existing research methods were inadequate for understanding or controlling the forces involved. The broader implications of the Smurl case continue to generate debate among researchers, theologians, and skeptics more than 3 decades after the family's escape from Chase Street. If the documented phenomena are authentic, and the evidence suggests they are, then humanity's understanding of supernatural forces requires fundamental revision. The entity that terrorized the Smurl family demonstrated capabilities that suggest supernatural beings may be far more intelligent, powerful, and strategically sophisticated than previous cases had indicated. More disturbing is the entity's apparent immortality and unlimited patience. The supernatural force that first emerged in 1974 continues to manifest in the Chase Street property, attacking new families with the same methodical precision and escalating violence that characterized its assault on the Smurls. This pattern suggests that some supernatural entities may be capable of maintaining their presence and hostility indefinitely, representing permanent threats to human communities rather than temporary disturbances that resolve naturally over time. The house at 328 Chase Street remains occupied as of 2024, though current residents have refused all requests for interviews or investigations. Local authorities in West Pittston continue to receive occasional complaints about strange sounds and unexplained disturbances emanating from the property, but official responses are limited to routine noise violation citations that have no impact on supernatural activity. Real estate records show that the property's value has never recovered from its association with the Smurl case, remaining significantly below market rates for comparable homes in the area. Insurance companies have classified the address as a high-risk property, requiring special coverage for residents willing to accept the supernatural dangers associated with occupancy. The Smurl family story has been documented in books, television movies, and documentaries, but media portrayals have consistently failed to capture the full scope and impact of their 15-year ordeal. Hollywood dramatizations focus on sensational supernatural effects while minimizing the psychological trauma and spiritual warfare that define the family's daily existence. Academic studies provide detailed analysis of individual phenomena while losing sight of the human cost of sustained supernatural terrorism. Perhaps most significantly, The Smurl case demonstrated that ordinary families living conventional lives can become targets of supernatural forces for reasons that remain completely unknown. The entity that chose to terrorize the Smurls offered no explanation for its actions, no demands that could be satisfied, and no conditions that might lead to peaceful coexistence. Its apparent motivation was simply the infliction of suffering on innocent people whose only crime was loving each other and maintaining faith in a world where such devotion made them visible to predators from dimensions beyond human comprehension. Today, the surviving members of the Smurl family prefer privacy over publicity, having learned that their experiences challenge people in ways that often result in ridicule, disbelief, or unwanted attention from individuals seeking supernatural thrills. They have built new lives based on the hard-won knowledge that evil is real, powerful, and sometimes inexplicably focused on destroying the happiness and faith of good people. Their story serves as both warning and testament. Warning that supernatural dangers may be far more prevalent and dangerous than most people realize, and testament that human love, faith, and determination can survive even the most extreme forms of spiritual warfare. The Smurl family endured 15 years of supernatural terrorism and emerged intact, forever changed but unbroken, proving that some bonds are stronger than the forces of darkness that seek to destroy them. The mystery of what awakened the entity on Chase Street, why it chose the Smurl family as its target, and whether similar forces threaten other communities remains unsolved. Until humanity develops better understanding of supernatural realms and the entities that inhabit them, families like the Smurls will continue to face dangers that no amount of faith, science, or human intervention seems capable of defeating. The only certainty is that the entity continues to wait in the house on Chase Street, patient and malevolent, ready to begin its cycle of terror with whatever family is brave enough or unfortunate enough to make that address their home.